Okay, so you want to own a medieval monastery, and here's the first strange thing about that sentence. To get in, you have to swear an oath that you'll never own anything ever again. No coin in your purse, no boots that are yours, not even the bed you sleep in. You hand your entire self over to poverty, silence, and cold stone floors before dawn. And somehow, at the end of that road, you're running one of the richest institutions in Europe. Here's a number to sit with. When the English crown finally sent auditors to weigh every religious house in the kingdom, one abbey in the West Country was pulling in more money in a single year than the King of England took from his own royal lands. A house full of men who had each personally vowed to own nothing was out earning the monarchy. So the whole thing lands on one question, and it's a good one. How do you build a fortune out of a vow of poverty? How does swearing off private property make you the landlord of half a county? Let's found one and find out. We're going to build this house from the ground up, the land it sits on, the thing it actually sells, which isn't what you think, the retirement scheme it runs on the side, the one that would make a modern insurance company nervous, the wool empire hiding behind the prayers, and then the trap. Because there's always a trap. And this one is baked so deep into the design that the very thing that made monasteries rich is the thing that eventually got their abbots dragged up a hill and hanged. Keep that image. We come back to it. And it won't be an accident. But we start where all of this starts. Not with God, with land. Part 1, you don't buy it, you're planted in it. First correction, and it's a big one. You cannot walk into the year 1150 and buy a monastery the way you'd buy a mill or a ship. A monastery isn't for sale because in law, it doesn't belong to a person. It belongs to itself, to God, and to a line of dead men who set it up. It's a body without a death date. So how does one come into existence? Somebody founds it. And that somebody is almost always a lord. Picture a wealthy land-owning family. More land than sons, a nervous relationship with the afterlife, and a very practical grasp of status. So they do something that looks, on the surface, like pure devotion. They carve off a chunk of their estate, hand it to a group of monks and say, build here, live here, pray here. And in exchange, 3 things flow back. Prestige. The medieval version of putting your name on a hospital wing, except the wing is eternal. A retirement plan because the founder's family keep the right to come, be fed, be housed, and be buried inside those walls. And third, the one that actually matters, the monks pray for his soul. Forever. Hold that word. Forever. Because it changes what the land is. When that lord gives an estate to a monastery, the land doesn't just change owners, it changes category. It passes into what English lawyers called mortmain, the dead hand. Land held by the dead hand never dies because the owner is an institution, and institutions don't have funerals. It never splits between heirs because monks have no heirs. It never leaves as a dowry because monks don't marry. It never gets sold by a drunk grandson to cover a gambling debt because there is no grandson. Think about that over 2 centuries. A normal, noble family bleeds land every generation, to marriages, to heirs splitting it 3 ways, to a bad son selling it, to war. The pie shrinks every time somebody dies. The monastery's pie only grows. Gifts come in and never go out. Land arrives and stops moving, gathering more land around it like frost around a stone. That is not a side effect of the vow of poverty. It is the vow of poverty working exactly as designed. The monks stay poor precisely so the house can stay rich. Some houses were so proud of it they carved it into metal. At Monte Cassino, the Benedictine mother house in Italy, the monks had the names of their estates inscribed onto the bronze doors of the basilica, panel after panel. When historians checked, the boasting was basically true. The estates on the doors matched the deeds in the chest. Property was the monument, so that's the ground you're standing on. land that came as a gift that can never leave, that compounds for centuries. Now, what do you do with it? You could just farm it, and plenty did, but farming isn't the business. The business is the thing the founder was actually paying for. And to understand that, we have to talk about the single most valuable product in the medieval economy. It weighed nothing. You couldn't hold it. And demand for it was, quite literally, infinite. Part 2. The product is prayer. Here's what nobody tells you about a monastery. It looks like a farm with a church attached. It's actually the reverse. It's a church with a farm attached. The farm exists to pay for the church, and the church is running a factory. The factory makes prayer. To see why anyone would pay for that, you have to get inside a medieval head, and specifically, you have to understand a place that, to them, was as real as France: Purgatory. By the 13th century, the church had settled on an afterlife with a waiting room in it. Heaven for the saints, hell for the damned, and in between for the vast ordinary middle of humanity. Purgatory. A holding area where the not quite good enough soul was burned clean before it was fit for heaven. And the burning could take years, centuries. Nobody knew, which was rather the point. But the sentence could be shortened. The living could help the dead. Prayer offered on earth, and above all the Mass, could reach into purgatory and pull time off a soul sentence like a lawyer knocking years off a prison term. Intercession, they called it. And the men whose Masses had the most pull were professional holy men who'd given their whole lives to God. Do you see the business yet? You're a rich man. You're going to die. And you're correctly terrified that when you do, you're facing an unknown stretch in the fire. Here is a house full of monks who will, in exchange for land, stand at an altar and say, "Mass for your soul, every day, forever." Long after your children are dead and your name means nothing to anyone alive, a monk you'll never meet will still be lifting the bread for a man 4 centuries gone, because a contract written in your lifetime says he must. That's what the founder bought with his estate, not a building. A perpetual subscription to intercession. He paid in land, and the dividend came in prayers, paid out after his death, forever. And the monks industrialized it. There was a belief, traced to a story about Pope Gregory the Great, that 30 Masses on 30 consecutive days could spring a specific soul from purgatory, a fixed product with a fixed delivery schedule. The rich didn't buy one Mass, they bought them by the 1,000, endowed in their wills, tied to specific altars, repeated on the anniversary of their death every year until the end of time. The greatest of these prayer factories was Cluny in Burgundy. Cluny's monks became so busy singing perpetual Masses for wealthy patrons that the day filled up almost entirely with liturgy, and there was barely time for the manual work St. Benedict's rule had demanded. So who did the digging? Serfs. Hired hands. The Cluniac monk's throat might ache from chanting, but his hands stayed soft, because his hands weren't the product. His voice was. Now notice the quiet problem this creates, because it's the engine of everything that follows. Benedict's rule was 2 duties held in balance. Ora et labora, pray and work. But once prayer became the thing people paid for, the balance broke. The monks moved upmarket into full-time prayer, and the labor, the sweat that produced the wool, that produced the money, had to come from somebody else. That somebody else is about to build you the biggest sheep operation in England. But before we get there, there's a second income stream running quietly under the prayers. And it's the most modern thing in the whole story. The monasteries were selling annuities. Part 3, the corrody, or how to run an insurance company in a robe. Let me describe a financial product, and you tell me what century it's from. A customer hands over a single large payment up front. Could be a bag of coins, could be the deed to a farm. In return, the institution guarantees him a fixed package of benefits for the rest of his life, however long that turns out to be. Food every day to a set standard, a room, firewood, clothing, care when he's sick. The institution is betting he'll die reasonably soon. He's betting he'll live a good long while and drink them dry. Whoever's right, the deal is locked the day he signs. That's a life annuity. That's longevity insurance. And medieval monasteries were selling it. by the 104 centuries before anyone worked out the mathematics of how to price it. They called it a corrody. Picture an elderly, moderately wealthy man. No children or children he'd rather not depend on. A farm he can't work anymore and a real fear of ending his days cold and hungry. So he trades. He signs the farm over to the monks, and in exchange, they keep him decently until he dies. He's converted an asset he can't manage into a lifetime of security. He's bought his retirement. For the monastery, it's a lump of capital today against a cost that ends the day the old man dies. If he dies in 2 years, they got a whole farm for 24 months of dinners. But what if he doesn't die? What if this leathery old survivor sits in the guest house for 20 years, eating your bread every morning, long after his farm's rent has stopped covering what he costs? Now you're feeding him for free out of the pockets of the men who came after him. The monastery is carrying what an actuary would recognize instantly: longevity risk. The risk that your annuitant simply refuses to die on schedule, and the abbots, without any of our tools, understood this in their bones. When they negotiated a corrody, they looked hard at the man in front of them. How old is he? How healthy does he look? A vigorous 50-year-old was a worse bet than a wheezing 70-year-old, and the price reflected it. There's a record from a German hospital where the administrator, sizing up an applicant, wrote something to the effect of, "The man is of a good age, we can hope. Hope he dies soon, that is." That's not cruelty. That's underwriting. And here's the twist historians didn't expect. When economists ran the surviving contracts through modern actuarial models, it turned out the monks weren't the soft touches everyone assumed. On the whole, corrodies looked like they were priced to make money, roughly what a rational annuity seller should have charged, centuries before the equations that describe it existed. They were pricing risk by instinct and getting it more or less right. There was a darker version too. Kings worked out that a monastery was a free retirement home. Edward I was notorious for it. When a royal servant got too old to work, the king would simply write to an abbey and order them to take the man in and keep him for life, on the crown's authority, for nothing. A corrody with no lump sum attached, all cost and no capital, forced on them by a man they couldn't refuse. So already your monastery has two businesses running. Upstairs, it sells prayer to the dying rich. Down the corridor, it sells retirement to the aging comfortable. Both turn other people's fear of the future into your capital today. But neither is what turned the great abbeys of England into the richest houses in the north. For that, we go back to the labor problem. Back to the men who did the work the singing monks no longer had time for. Because one order took that army of laborers, pointed them at the empty hills, and built something the medieval world had never seen. An industrial export machine run by men who'd sworn to renounce the world. Part 4. The Accidental Wool Empire. Here's the irony at the heart of it. Cluny got rich by being magnificent, and there was a backlash. A reform movement, the Cistercians, looked at Cluny's fine linen and its soft-handed monks living off serfs and recoiled. They wanted to go back to Benedict. Hard work, plain food, silence, remote places far from the corruption of towns. They deliberately built out in the wilderness, in the cold, empty valleys nobody else wanted, and swore to live by the labor of their own hands. And by trying to be poor, they accidentally became the biggest agribusiness in England. Because those empty valleys they chose for their austerity, those cold northern hills nobody wanted, that's sheep country, some of the finest wool-growing land in Europe, and they had it almost to themselves. The Cistercians also solved the labor problem in a way Cluny never had. They created a second tier of member, the lay brother, the conversus. Men, usually of humble background, who joined and took vows, but weren't there to sing the Latin hours. They were there to work. The farming, the herding, the building, the sheer grind. This gave the Cistercians a huge, disciplined, unpaid permanent workforce that would never demand wages, never strike, and never leave. And instead of scattered manors farmed by tenants, they ran granges, big, consolidated, directly managed farms, each worked by lay brothers. And they pointed a lot of them at sheep. The numbers are staggering. Rievaulx, up in Yorkshire, ran a flock of something like 14,000 sheep. Fountains Abbey, the largest, ran around 18,000. At its height, Rievaulx housed roughly 140 choir monks and around 500 lay brothers. Read that ratio again. For every monk singing in the church, there were 3.5 men out on the hills doing the work. This wasn't a prayer house with a farm. It was a wool corporation with a chapel in the middle of it, and the wool was superb. It was the raw material the entire textile industry of Europe was desperate for, and the finest monastic wool sat at the top of the market. So the buyers came to the Abbey door, Flemish merchants and above all Italians, the big Florentine and Lucchese firms, names you'd recognize from the world of banking, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Riccardi, the Frescobaldi. The same houses financing kings were standing in Yorkshire haggling over fleeces. We have the actual contracts. In 1276, Fountains Abbey agreed to supply Florentine merchants with 62 sacks of wool for 697.5 marks. And the contract is fussy in a way that tells you this was a serious commodity trade. No inferior grades, no black or gray fleece mixed with the good white, no pelt wool, no short clippings, no clotted or coarse stuff. The Abbey had to clean it, sort it, weigh it, and deliver it to a standard the buyer specified in writing. This is quality control. This is a supply contract you could file in a modern warehouse. So the picture is complete. A house of men sworn to poverty and manual labor and withdrawal from the world had become a vertically integrated wool business, exporting to international markets through the biggest financiers in Europe. They'd renounced the world so hard, they'd cornered one of its most valuable commodities. By now, this looks like the perfect machine. Land that only grows, prayer sold to the dying, annuity sold to the old, and a wool empire on top feeding the looms of a continent. It looks unbreakable. Here's what broke it. And the seed of it is sitting inside that beautiful wool contract, if you look closely at when the money changed hands. Part 5. The trap in the wool contract. The merchants didn't just want this year's wool, they wanted next year's, and the year after, and the year after that. They offered to buy the clip in advance. Several years of it, paid for now, in a single glorious lump of ready cash handed over at the Abbey gate today, against wool that didn't exist yet, wool that hadn't grown on sheep that hadn't been born. To an abbot, that lump of cash is intoxicating because monasteries always needed money now. They were forever building a new church, a new dormitory, a bigger chapter house, the endless expensive business of glorifying God in stone. And here's a merchant offering to fund all of it up front in exchange for wool the Abbey was going to produce anyway. It feels like free money. Sign here. Now look at what that contract actually is, stripped of the sheep. Someone gives you a large sum today. You promise to deliver something valuable over the next several years. When it's all delivered, they've made a healthy margin. A merchant might hand over the equivalent of £4 for a sack today and expect to sell it on the continent for double. That's a loan. A loan with the interest hidden inside the discount, wearing the costume of a wool sale. And just like the bankers of Florence dressing up loans as currency trades to slip past the church's ban on interest, everyone knew exactly what it was. The Abbey had mortgaged its future to build in the present. And a mortgage on the future has one catastrophic weakness. It assumes the future shows up. Here's the sentence that gutted the wool monasteries of England. You've sold, for cash you've already spent, wool that your sheep haven't yet grown. What happens if the sheep die? They died. In the early 14th century, disease tore through English flocks. Sheep scab, murrain, waves of it killing animals by the thousand. And then on top of the disease came the Great Famine. Between 1315 and 1322, the weather turned catastrophic across northern Europe. Harvests failed, animals starved, people starved. Contemporaries had a name for it that just means the Great Dearth. Run it through the contract. The Abbey owes a merchant 100 sacks of wool over the next several years. It has already spent the money. And then half the flock dies. The wool it legally owes cannot be produced. But the debt does not die with the sheep. The debt is fine. The contract doesn't care that your lambs froze in the field. You still owe the wool. So what does an abbot do? He borrows more. New debt to cover the wool he can't deliver on the old debt. And now he's servicing borrowing with more borrowing, and the hole gets deeper every year. We can watch exactly this happen to a real house. Pipewell Abbey in Northamptonshire, a small Cistercian house that produced beautiful, high-quality wool and, on the strength of it, signed exactly these forward contracts. Over roughly 50 years, from around 1280 to 1330, you can trace it sliding from a promising producer into total penury. Ambitious contract, then a shortfall, then a refinancing, then a bigger contract to cover it, then another shortfall. The classic spiral. By the end, they were accepting sheep from their creditors just to rebuild the flocks that owed the wool. The famine finished the job. And Pipewell wasn't alone. Revo, one of the giants, was carrying debts of over 1,500 pounds by 1288. These houses had found the oldest trap in finance, the one every generation rediscovers, borrowing against a future that then declines to arrive on time. The wool boom that made them rich was the same instrument that ruined them, because a forward sale is a loan, and a loan is a promise about tomorrow, and tomorrow out on a Yorkshire hillside full of dead sheep does not always keep its promises. So, knowing all that, could you actually get rich owning one of these? Let's do the honest accounting. Part 6. The good year, the ordinary year, and the year the letter comes. A great year for a large abbey is a beautiful thing. The rents roll in from dozens of scattered manors, land that cost you nothing because it was given, land you'll never have to buy again because it can never leave. The wool comes off the hills clean and heavy, and the Italian buyers pay top price. The offerings pile up at the shrine because the pilgrims are coming. Glastonbury in a good year had few rivals. Only Canterbury, with the shrine of Thomas Becket, and Walsingham drew bigger crowds. Every pilgrim is a candle bought, a coin left at the altar, a bed rented in the guest hall. In a year like that, a great English abbey is one of the most profitable enterprises in the country, and it barely feels like it's trying. An ordinary year is quieter, but comfortable. The rents are the bedrock, and the rents don't move much. You spend enormously on food for a large community, on building works that never stop, on hospitality and charity, and the sheer cost of magnificence. But the land underneath is doing the heavy lifting, silently, the way it has for 2 centuries. A bad year is not a low number. A bad year is a letter. It's a lay brother riding in from a distant grange to say the flock has the scab, half the sheep are dead, and the wool you sold 3 years ago for money you spent 2 years ago cannot be delivered. It's a Florentine agent standing in your chapter house politely with a contract in his hand, asking when he might expect his 100 sacks. The buildings haven't changed. The rents haven't changed. But a promise you made to the future has come due, and the future is empty. That's the shape of it. Enormous stable wealth from the land, sitting on a thin, dangerous layer of debt against the wool and the harvest. And for a long time, through boom and famine and plague, it held. The land was so deep and so permanent that even ruinous management usually couldn't sink a great house completely. The mortmain kept them afloat. Nothing could take the land away. Nothing, that is, except the one force in the kingdom bigger than the dead hand of the church, the living hand of the king. And in the 1530s, that hand came down. Part 7. The Audit and the Hill. For 400 years, the monasteries had one unbeatable advantage: permanence. They outlived every king, every war, every bad harvest, because the institution never died and the land never left. But permanence is only a strength as long as the man at the top of the kingdom agrees to respect it. And in 1534, England got a king who didn't. Henry VIII needed 2 things the monasteries had. He needed to be undisputed head of the church in England, which the monks, loyal to Rome, stood in the way of. And, far more urgently, he needed money. He'd burned through the fortune his careful father left him, and the monasteries sat on the largest untapped wealth in the country, land that had been accumulating, tax-sheltered and unsellable for 4 centuries. The dead hand was holding a fortune, and Henry decided to pry the fingers open. But first he did something very modern. Before you seize an asset, you value it. In 1535, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, sent commissioners across the entire kingdom to weigh every religious house, every manor, every rent, every mill, every flock written down. They did it in about 6 months, and the result is sometimes called the Tudor Domesday, because like Domesday, it was a total inventory of a country's wealth. Its formal name was the Valor Ecclesiasticus, the value of the church. And when the figures came back, they were vast. The exact totals vary depending on how you count, but the monastic wealth of England ran to well over 100,000 pounds of income a year, at a time when the crown's own ordinary revenue was around 100,000 pounds. The church, and above all the monasteries, controlled something like 1/10 of the entire wealth of the kingdom. Cromwell is said to have told the king he could make him the richest prince in Christendom. Looking at those numbers, he wasn't wrong. The audit was the death warrant. It just hadn't been signed yet. It came in 2 waves, In 1536, an act of parliament dissolved the smaller houses, everything under £200 a year, and the crown swallowed their land. A few hundred houses gone in the first bite. Then, from 1538, the machine turned on the great abbeys, the giants that had stood since before the Normans. They weren't technically covered by the first act, so the crown simply pressured, threatened, and bullied them into voluntarily surrendering one by one. Watch what happened to Rivaux, the wool giant we built, a house that once held 140 monks and 500 lay brothers that ran 14,000 sheep, that had contracts with the bankers of Florence. When the crown's men came in 1538, the community had shrunk to 23 monks. They surrendered. It was over, and then there was Glastonbury. Glastonbury was the prize. The second richest abbey in all of England, behind only Westminster. So rich its annual income was greater than the king's own. Ancient beyond ancient. Wrapped in the legend of Joseph of Arimathea, a pilgrim magnate second only to Becket's shrine. Its abbot, Richard Whiting, was an old man, well into his 70s, who'd spent years carefully doing whatever the crown asked to keep his house alive. He'd even signed the oath making Henry head of the church. It didn't matter. By 1539, Glastonbury was one of the last great houses standing in the West, and Henry wanted it. And when Whiting wouldn't simply hand over one of the wealthiest institutions in the country, they charged him with treason. The trial was a formality. The verdict was decided before it started. One of the Crown's own agents on the scene, a man named Richard Pollard, had already been writing to Cromwell, and the tone is one of the coldest things in the whole story. Just weeks before, Pollard had reported finding no real wrongdoing at the Abbey at all. And yet here he was, angling for the profitable job of surveying the seized estates, hoping to keep the work in his own family. The man knew the abbot was innocent and was already dividing up the spoils. On the 15th of November, 1539, they tied the old abbot to a wooden hurdle and dragged him by horse through the streets of his own town, past the abbey he'd governed, up to the top of the hill that overlooks it all, Glastonbury Tor. Two of his monks, the men who'd kept the abbey's accounts, were dragged up with him. And on the summit, in sight of everything he'd spent his life protecting, Richard Whiting was hanged, and then his body was cut into quarters. His severed head was fixed over the great gate of the abbey so that everyone coming to the ruins of the richest religious house in the West could see exactly what the permanence of the church was now worth. By 1540, it was finished. Something like 800 religious houses gone. The greatest transfer of property in English history until modern times. And here's the final turn. The one that ties this back to every empire that runs on other people's trust. The land didn't stay with the crown for long. Henry needed cash more than estates, so he sold most of it, fast and cheap, to the nobles and the rising gentry and the loyal merchants. And they sold and traded and married it onward. The monastic land that had been frozen for 400 years suddenly liquefied and flooded into the hands of a new class of English landowners who built their country houses out of the abbey stone and founded their family fortunes on the abbey fields. That's who got rich in the end, not the monks, pensioned off or scattered, not really even the king, who spent the windfall almost as fast as it came in, on war. The men who got rich were the ones standing closest to the wreckage when it came down. The buyers, the surveyors, the Pollards, the families who bought a monastery for a song and were still living off it 3 centuries later, which is the same ending as the Templars, whose bank was seized by the very kings who owed it money. The same ending as the great guilds, whose treasuries the crown eventually swallowed too. The institution accumulates for centuries under a rule everyone agrees to respect, right up until the day the most powerful man in the land decides not to respect it. And then all that patient permanence turns out to have been sitting in a vault with someone else's key in the lock. Part 8, the verdict. So, could you get rich owning a medieval monastery? The honest answer is that you were never going to get rich personally because you'd sworn never to own anything, and that vow was real. You'd die with nothing in your name. but the thing you served got staggeringly rich. And it did so precisely because you and every brother before and after you owned nothing. Your poverty was the flywheel, because no monk had heirs, nothing ever left, because the house never died, everything compounded. A vow of poverty run across 1,000 men and 400 years is one of the most powerful wealth accumulation engines ever built. It just isn't built for you. It's built for the thing you disappear into. And look at what it actually sold underneath all the land and the wool. Strip it back and every product was the same product wearing different clothes. The founder buying perpetual masses was buying relief from the fear of death. The old man buying a corrody was buying security against an uncertain future. The merchant buying wool forward was buying a claim on a future harvest. The pilgrim leaving a coin at the shrine was buying a moment of contact with something eternal. Every customer at every window of the monastery was really buying the same thing: time. Time after death. Time in old age. Time next year. Time forever. The monastery was in the business of selling time to people frightened of running out of it. The bankers of Florence found a way to charge for time by hiding it inside a currency trade. The monasteries found a way to charge for time by promising it stretched past the grave. And both discovered the same hard truth in the same century. You can sell the future for a very long while and grow enormous doing it, right up until the moment the future arrives and looks nothing like the contract. You thought you were joining a house of prayer and silence. What you were really joining was the oldest, most patient, most profitable business in Europe. A machine for turning other people's fear of the future into permanent wealth. It ran for 400 years. And then a king with an audit and an empty treasury proved that permanent was just a word. And the dead hand, it turned out, could be pried open after all.